The American Civil War is the most consequential event in the history of the United States. Between 1861 and 1865, roughly 750,000 Americans died fighting each other, which is more than every other American war combined up to that point. Entire cities were burned to the ground. Families were literally torn apart, with brothers fighting on opposite sides. And when it was over, 4 million enslaved human beings were freed. The federal government was transformed, and the very meaning of what it meant to be an American had changed forever. Now, most people know the basics. The North fought the South. Lincoln freed the slaves. The Union won. But what most people do not fully understand is how it actually got to that point. How did a nation that had existed for less than 100 years, a nation founded on the ideals of liberty and self-governance, tear itself apart in the bloodiest conflict in its history? That is what we are going to cover here. And I want to warn you up front, this is going to be a long one. Because the truth is, the Civil War did not start with the firing on Fort Sumter in April of 1861. It did not start with Lincoln's election in 1860. You could argue it did not even start in the 1850s. The roots of this conflict go all the way back to the founding of the nation itself. And in order to truly understand why this war happened, you have to understand the full story from the very beginning. So, let us start there. Let us start at the founding. Before we go any further, if at any moment you feel this is where you belong, don't hesitate to subscribe. Settle in, hit the button, and enjoy the story accompanied by the gentle sound of rain in the background. In the summer of 1787, delegates from 12 of the 13 states gathered in Philadelphia to draft a new constitution. The Articles of Confederation, the nation's first governing document, had proven too weak to hold the young country together. There was no strong central government, no power to tax, and no unified military policy. The country needed a new framework, and the men who gathered in Philadelphia that summer were tasked with creating one. Now here is the thing that people often forget about the Constitutional Convention. These men did not agree on everything. Far from it. They argued bitterly about representation, about executive power, and about the role of the federal government versus the states. But there was one issue that loomed over everything else, one issue that nearly destroyed the convention before the Constitution could even be written. That issue was slavery. By 1787, slavery was already a deeply entrenched institution in the southern states, Virginia, the Carolinas, Georgia, and Maryland. Their entire economies depended on enslaved labor. Tobacco, rice, and indigo, these were the cash crops that made southern planters wealthy, and all of them required massive amounts of labor. Enslaved people were not just workers in the South. They were property. They were wealthy. A large slaveholder in Virginia might have more of his total net worth tied up in the people he owned than in the land he farmed. The northern states were different. Not because Northerners were inherently more moral on this question, we will get to that, but because their economies had developed along different lines. The climate and soil of New England and the mid-Atlantic states were not suited to the same kind of large-scale plantation agriculture. Slavery existed in the North, but it was far less economically central, and several northern states had already begun the process of gradually abolishing it. Pennsylvania passed a gradual emancipation law in 1780. Massachusetts effectively ended slavery through a court ruling in 1783. Connecticut and Rhode Island followed with gradual emancipation laws in 1784. So when these delegates sat down in Philadelphia, they had a problem. The southern states were not going to join any union that threatened the institution of slavery, period. Without the South, there was no United States, and the northern delegates knew this. The result was a series of compromises that would embed the issue of slavery into the very DNA of the new nation. Let me walk you through the three most important ones. First, the 3/5 compromise. This one comes up a lot, and it is frequently misunderstood. The question was about representation in Congress. The more people a state had, the more representatives it got in the House of Representatives, and the more electoral votes it would have for choosing the president. Southern states wanted their enslaved populations counted for purposes of representation. Now think about how twisted that is for a moment. These states treated enslaved people as property under the law. They could be bought, sold, inherited, and used as collateral for loans. But when it came time to count heads for political power, suddenly the South wanted them counted as people. Northern delegates pushed back. If enslaved people cannot vote, cannot hold office, cannot participate in government in any way, why should they be counted for representation? The compromise they reached was that each enslaved person would be counted as 3/5 of a person for purposes of representation and taxation. This gave the slave states significantly more political power than their free populations alone would have warranted. To give you a sense of the impact, by 1800, this extra representation gave the South roughly 15 to 20 additional seats in the House of Representatives. That is an enormous amount of political power, and it would shape American politics for the next 7 decades. Second, the slave trade clause. Some delegates, even some from the South, wanted to ban the international slave trade entirely. Others, particularly from the deep South states of South Carolina and Georgia, insisted it remain open. The compromise was that Congress could not ban the importation of enslaved people for 20 years until 1808. After that date, Congress could act, and it did. In 1808, the international slave trade was officially banned. But here is the important thing: the domestic slave trade, the buying and selling of enslaved people within the United States, continued without any restriction whatsoever, and it would become one of the most brutal and profitable enterprises in American history. Third, the Fugitive Slave Clause. This one is less well known, but it would become enormously important. Article 4 of the Constitution stated that any person held to service or labor in one state who escaped to another state could not be freed by the laws of that second state, but had to be delivered up to the person claiming their labor. In plain language, if an enslaved person escaped from Virginia to Pennsylvania, Pennsylvania had to return that person to their enslaver. This clause essentially meant that the entire nation, including the free states, was constitutionally obligated to enforce the institution of slavery. Think about what that means for a moment. A person in Massachusetts who morally opposed slavery was still bound by the Constitution to assist in the capture and return of people fleeing bondage. Now, I want to be clear about something. Many of the founders understood that slavery was a moral problem. Thomas Jefferson, a man who enslaved over 600 people in his lifetime, famously wrote in his notes on the state of Virginia that he trembled for his country when he reflected that God was just. James Madison, the primary architect of the Constitution, called slavery a great evil. Even some Southern delegates at the convention expressed hope that slavery would eventually die out on its own. But they did not end it. They compromised with it. They accommodated it. They wrote protections for it directly into the founding document of the nation. And in doing so, they handed a ticking time bomb to future generations. They kicked the can down the road and hoped that someone in the future would figure it out. That decision, or rather that failure to decide, is where the story of the Civil War truly begins. To understand why the slavery question became more dangerous over time rather than less, you have to understand how differently the North and South developed over the first half of the 19th century. Because these two regions did not just disagree about slavery. They became fundamentally different societies with fundamentally different economies, cultures, and visions for what America should be. Let us start with the South. The Southern economy was built on a single foundation, and that foundation was enslaved labor, producing agricultural goods for export. In the late 1700s, the crop that mattered most was tobacco, centered in Virginia and Maryland. But tobacco wore out the soil. Planters were constantly moving west, looking for new land to plant. By the early 1800s, the Southern economy was starting to stagnate, and some historians believe that slavery might have eventually become economically unviable in the Upper South, might have slowly declined simply because tobacco was not profitable enough to sustain it. and then came cotton. In 1793, Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin, a simple mechanical device that could separate cotton fibers from their seeds 50 times faster than a person could do it by hand. Before the cotton gin, short staple cotton, the kind that could grow across most of the Deep South, was barely worth growing because processing it was so labor-intensive. After the cotton gin, cotton became the most valuable crop in the American economy virtually overnight. The numbers tell the story. In 1790, the United States produced about 3,000 bales of cotton. By 1800, that number had jumped to 73,000 bales. By 1820, it was 335,000 bales. By 1850, the South was producing nearly 3 million bales of cotton per year, accounting for roughly 3/4 of the world's cotton supply. British textile mills, the engine of the world's most advanced industrial economy, depended on Southern cotton. Cotton is king was not just a slogan. It was an economic reality, and cotton required labor, enormous amounts of labor. Planting it, cultivating it, picking it, processing it, all of this was done by enslaved people under brutal conditions. Cotton had to be planted in the spring, tended through the blistering summer heat, and then picked by hand in the fall. Picking cotton was backbreaking work. An enslaved person might be expected to pick 150 to 200 pounds of cotton in a single day. Those who fell short of their quota were beaten. The picking season ran from August through December, with every man, woman, and child in the fields from dawn until it was too dark to see. The economics of cotton made the ownership of enslaved people enormously profitable. A healthy, young, enslaved man might sell for $1,000 to $2,000 in the 1850s. That is the equivalent of roughly $30,000 to $60,000 today. Enslaved women who could bear children were valued not just for their labor, but for their reproductive capacity. The children they bore became the property of the slaveholder. This was a system in which human reproduction was, quite literally, treated as a business investment. One of the cruelest dimensions of American slavery was that slaveholders understood their wealth grew not just through the cotton their workers picked, but through the children their workers bore. The explosion of cotton did not just preserve slavery, it supercharged it. In 1800, there were roughly 900,000 enslaved people in the United States. By 1860, that number had grown to nearly 4 million. The domestic slave trade, the buying and selling of human beings between states, became a massive industry. Enslaved people in the Upper South, where tobacco was declining, were sold in enormous numbers to the cotton plantations of the Deep South, Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, Texas. Families were torn apart. Children were separated from parents. It was, as the historian Ira Berlin described it, a second Middle Passage, devastating in its human cost. Now let us look at the North. The northern states were undergoing a completely different kind of transformation. Starting in the early 1800s and accelerating through the 1820s, 30s, and 40s, the North industrialized. Factories sprang up in New England and the mid-Atlantic states. Textile mills, ironworks, shoe factories, machine shops, the North was becoming a manufacturing economy. Cities grew rapidly. New York City, which had a population of around 60,000 in 1800, had over 800,000 by 1860. Immigration fueled this growth. Millions of people from Ireland, Germany, and other European countries poured into northern cities looking for work. The North developed a more diversified economy with a growing middle class, an expanding railroad network, and a culture that valued free labor, the idea that a man should be able to work for himself, improve his condition, and rise in society. This was not just an economic philosophy. It was a deeply held belief about what America was supposed to be. Abraham Lincoln captured this idea when he said that the country should be a place where every man could have an unfettered start and a fair chance in the race of life. Now, I need to make something very clear here. The North was not some racial paradise. Far from it. Most northern whites were deeply racist by any modern standard. Several northern states had laws restricting or outright banning black people from settling within their borders. Free black people in the North faced discrimination in housing, employment, education, and public life. The vast majority of Northerners in the early 1800s did not believe in racial equality. They did not want to live alongside black people as equals. Many of them did not even want black people in their states at all. But, and this is a crucial but, most Northerners also did not want slavery expanding into new territories. Not because they cared about the welfare of enslaved people, necessarily, but because they did not want to compete with slave labor. A white farmer or worker in Illinois or Ohio did not want to move to a new Western territory only to find himself competing against a plantation owner who did not have to pay his workers. The free labor ideology was fundamentally about protecting the economic interests and opportunities of white workers and settlers. It was opposition to the spread of slavery, not opposition to racism. That distinction between opposing the spread of slavery and opposing slavery itself is absolutely essential to understanding the politics of this era. The key point here is that by the 1850s, the North and South had become two different civilizations sharing one government. The South was rural, agricultural, dependent on enslaved labor, and culturally conservative. The North was urbanizing, industrializing, attracting immigrants, and oriented toward free labor and commerce. These two regions increasingly saw the world through completely different lenses, and the friction between them was only going to get worse. Now, I want to spend some time on something that often gets overlooked when people talk about the causes of the Civil War, and that is the evolution of how white Southerners thought about and talked about slavery. Because the way Southern leaders defended slavery changed dramatically between the founding era and the 1850s, and that change in ideology made compromise far more difficult. During the founding era, as I mentioned, many of the Southern founders acknowledged that slavery was morally problematic. Jefferson called it a moral and political depravity. George Mason, a Virginia delegate at the Constitutional Convention, said that slavery had a pernicious effect on the morals of the people. Even slaveholders used language like necessary evil to describe the institution. The general assumption among many was that slavery would gradually fade away over time. But it did not fade away. It grew. And as it grew, as cotton made slavery more profitable than ever, Southern leaders stopped apologizing for it. They stopped calling it a necessary evil and started calling it a positive good. The intellectual architect of this transformation was John C. Calhoun of South Carolina. Calhoun served as Vice President, Secretary of State, Secretary of War, and Senator over his long political career. He was brilliant, intense, and absolutely committed to the defense of slavery. In 1837, Calhoun stood on the floor of the United States Senate and declared that slavery was not a necessary evil, but a positive good. He argued that enslaved black people were better off under slavery than they would be as free people. He claimed that slavery civilized them, Christianized them, and provided for them in ways that free labor never could. He pointed to the poverty of factory workers in northern cities and in England, and argued that enslaved people were, in fact, treated better than free laborers. This was not just Calhoun talking. By the 1840s and 50s, the positive good argument had become mainstream across the white South. Pro-slavery ideology was developed and disseminated through churches, through universities, through newspapers and pamphlets. Ministers cited the Bible to justify slavery, pointing to passages in the Old Testament where slavery was practiced and the New Testament where Paul instructs enslaved people to obey their masters. Scientists and doctors produced pseudo-scientific theories about racial difference, arguing that black people were biologically inferior and naturally suited to bondage. Legal scholars argued that property rights, including the right to own human beings, were the foundation of liberty, and that any attempt to restrict slavery was an attack on Southern freedom. By the 1850s, the defense of slavery had become the central organizing principle of Southern politics and Southern identity. Slavery was not something that white Southerners merely tolerated or profited from. It was something they believed in. They believed it was right. They believed it was ordained by God. They believed that their entire civilization depended on it, and they were willing to destroy the Union to protect it. Understanding this ideological transformation is critical because it explains why compromise became impossible. You can compromise on tariffs, you can compromise on internal improvements, you can split the difference on land policy, but how do you compromise with a society that has convinced itself that owning human beings is not just acceptable, but morally good and divinely sanctioned? How do you find middle ground with people who believe that any restriction on slavery is an existential threat to their way of life? You cannot, and that inability to compromise is at the heart of why the Civil War happened. Before we move into the political crises that tore the country apart, I want to give equal time to the North and talk about how Northern attitudes towards slavery evolved over this period. Because, as I said earlier, the North was not a monolith of abolitionist sentiment, not even close. In the early 1800s, most white Northerners were, frankly, indifferent to slavery. It existed in the South. It was not their problem. Many Northern businesses were deeply entangled with the slave economy. New York City's financial institutions provided loans and credit to Southern planters. Northern textile mills processed Southern cotton. Northern ships transported slave-grown goods. The Northern economy was not separate from slavery. It was deeply connected to it. Active abolitionism, the movement to immediately and completely end slavery everywhere in the United States, was a fringe position for most of this period. The abolitionists were considered radicals, troublemakers, and extremists. William Lloyd Garrison launched his anti-slavery newspaper, The Liberator, in 1831, and in his very first issue he wrote words that would echo through American history. "I am in earnest, I will not equivocate, I will not excuse, I will not retreat a single inch, and I will be heard." And he was heard. But he was also despised by large segments of Northern society. In 1835, a mob in Boston dragged Garrison through the streets with a rope around his waist. Anti-slavery meetings were regularly broken up by mobs. Elijah Lovejoy, an abolitionist newspaper editor in Illinois, was murdered by a pro-slavery mob in 1837. So the abolitionists were brave, but they were not popular. What slowly changed Northern opinion was not a sudden moral awakening. It was a series of political crises that made Northerners feel that the South and the institution of slavery were threatening their own interests and their own liberties. Over and over again, from the 1820s through the 1850s, events conspired to convince more and more Northerners that there was a slave power, a conspiracy of wealthy slaveholders who controlled the federal government and were using that control to expand slavery, suppress free speech, and trample on the rights of white Northerners. Whether or not such a conspiracy actually existed in the coordinated way that Northerners imagined is debatable, but the perception was powerful, and it was fueled by real events. And those events are what we are going to turn to now. The first great crisis over slavery in the new nation came in 1819, when the territory of Missouri applied for admission to the Union as a state. Now, this might seem like a routine administrative matter. New states were being admitted all the time as the country expanded westward, but Missouri's application detonated like a bomb in Congress, and it did so for a very specific reason. At the time, there were 22 states in the Union, 11 free and 11 slave. That balance was not accidental. It was critically important because in the United States Senate, every state gets 2 senators regardless of its population. So, as long as the number of free states and slave states was equal, neither side could pass legislation that the other found unacceptable. The balance of power in the Senate was the guardrail that kept the slavery question from tearing the country apart. Missouri wanted to enter as a slave state. If it did, the slave states would have a 12-11 advantage in the Senate. Northern representatives saw this as unacceptable. A New York congressman named James Tallmadge introduced an amendment that would gradually abolish slavery in Missouri as a condition of its admission. The reaction from the South was volcanic. Southern leaders declared that Congress had no right to restrict slavery in new states. They argued that property rights were sacred and that slaveholders had the constitutional right to bring their property, including enslaved people, into any territory or state. Some Southern members of Congress openly threatened secession and civil war if the amendment passed. The debate raged for months. It was the first time that the slavery question had produced a genuine crisis that threatened the survival of the Union. The language used on both sides was alarming. Senators and representatives spoke of disunion, of bloodshed, of irreconcilable differences. The crisis was resolved, or more accurately papered over, by what became known as the Missouri Compromise of 1820. Here is what the compromise did. Missouri was admitted as a slave state. Maine, which had been part of Massachusetts, was admitted as a free state, preserving the balance at 12 and 12. And a line was drawn across the remaining territory of the Louisiana Purchase at the latitude of 36 degrees, 30 minutes. North of that line, slavery would be prohibited in all future states. South of that line, slavery would be permitted. Now, at the time, many Americans breathed a sigh of relief. The Union had been preserved. The crisis had passed. But there were those who saw deeper. Secretary of State John Quincy Adams wrote in his diary that the compromise was nothing more than a title page to a great, tragic volume. He saw that the fundamental issue, whether slavery would expand, had not been resolved, merely deferred, and every time it resurfaced, the stakes would be higher. The compromise also established a dangerous precedent. It showed that slavery was not going to quietly fade away, as some founders had hoped. It showed that the slave states were prepared to fight fiercely, even threaten disunion, to protect and expand their institution. And it showed that the free states, when push came to shove, would compromise rather than risk breaking the Union. The South learned a lesson from Missouri. If you threaten loudly enough, you get what you want. Thomas Jefferson, who was in retirement at Monticello, recognized it for what it was. He wrote in a letter that the Missouri crisis was like a fire bell in the night that had awakened and filled me with terror. He called it the knell of the Union. Jefferson understood that the underlying issue had not been resolved. It had merely been postponed. The question of whether slavery could expand into new territories was going to come back, and when it did, it would be even harder to resolve. Jefferson was right. The Missouri Compromise held for over 30 years, but it was a bandage on a wound that was only getting deeper. Before we move to the next great slavery crisis, I want to take a detour through the Nullification Crisis of 1832 and 1833. Now, this crisis was technically about tariffs, not slavery, but it is absolutely essential to understanding the Civil War because it established the intellectual and political framework that secessionists would later use to justify leaving the Union. And it introduces us more fully to John C. Calhoun, whom I mentioned earlier. Here is the background. In 1828, Congress passed a very high protective tariff, a tax on imported goods. The tariff was designed to protect northern manufacturing by making imported goods more expensive, which would encourage Americans to buy domestically produced goods instead. Northern factory owners loved this. Southern planters hated it. Why did the South hate the tariff? Because the Southern economy was based on exporting raw materials, especially cotton, and importing manufactured goods. A high tariff meant that the manufactured goods Southerners needed to buy tools, clothing, machinery were more expensive. And since many of the countries that bought Southern cotton might retaliate with their own tariffs on American goods, it could also hurt Southern exports. Southerners saw the tariff as essentially a tax on the South to subsidize the North. They called it the Tariff of Abominations. South Carolina, led intellectually by its senator and former vice president John C. Calhoun, took the most extreme position. Calhoun developed a theory called nullification. This theory held that individual states had the right to declare federal laws unconstitutional and refuse to enforce them within their borders. The logic went like this. The states had created the federal government through the Constitution. Therefore, the states were the ultimate arbiters of what was and was not constitutional. If a state determined that a federal law exceeded the government's constitutional authority, that state could nullify. It simply refused to obey it. In November of 1832, South Carolina held a convention and passed an ordinance of nullification, declaring the federal tariff null and void within the state. They also threatened to secede from the Union if the federal government attempted to enforce the tariff by force. President Andrew Jackson, who was himself a slaveholder from Tennessee, was having none of it. Jackson was a fierce nationalist. He believed that the Union was perpetual and that no state had the right to defy federal law or leave the Union. He sent a forceful message to South Carolina, warning that disunion by armed force is treason. He asked Congress for authorization to use military force to enforce the tariff. At the same time, a compromise tariff was negotiated that lowered rates enough to give South Carolina an off-ramp. South Carolina backed down. The immediate crisis passed. But the ideas that Calhoun had articulated, state sovereignty, the right of states to resist federal authority, the right of secession as a last resort, those ideas did not go away. They went underground and festered. They would reemerge with devastating force 30 years later. And I want to point out something that many people miss about the Nullification Crisis. Yes, it was about the tariff on the surface. But Calhoun and the South Carolina leaders were also deeply worried about a more fundamental question. If the federal government could impose a tariff over the objection of southern states, what else could it do? Could it restrict slavery in the territories? Could it ban the interstate slave trade? Could it eventually abolish slavery altogether? The tariff crisis was, at its core, about whether the South could protect its peculiar institution from a federal government in which the North was gaining more and more power due to its larger and faster growing population. States' rights, in this context, was always about one thing above all others. It was about the right of southern states to maintain and expand the institution of slavery. That is not a modern interpretation. That is what the people at the time said openly. While the Nullification Crisis was playing out in the halls of power, something else was happening in American society that would further inflame tensions. The abolitionist movement was growing, slowly but steadily, and it was making its voice heard in ways that infuriated the South. In the 1830s, abolitionists began flooding Congress with petitions calling for the end of slavery in the District of Columbia, in the territories, and eventually everywhere. This was their constitutional right. The First Amendment guarantees the right to petition the government for redress of grievances. By 1836, Congress was receiving hundreds of thousands of these petitions. Southern members of Congress were outraged. They did not want these petitions read, debated, or even acknowledged. And so, in 1836, the House of Representatives passed what became known as the Gag Rule. This rule automatically tabled all anti-slavery petitions without any discussion. They would be received and then immediately set aside, unread and undebated. Now, former President John Quincy Adams, who was serving in the House of Representatives after his presidency, the only former president to do so, led a years-long fight against the Gag Rule. Adams was not an abolitionist, but he was a fierce defender of the right of petition and free speech. He argued, persuasively, that the Gag Rule was a violation of fundamental constitutional rights. And he kept pushing. Every session, he would attempt to present anti-slavery petitions. Every session, he would be silenced. The fight over the Gag Rule lasted 8 years, from 1836 to 1844, when the rule was finally repealed. But the damage was done. The Gag Rule convinced many Northerners who did not particularly care about enslaved people that the slave power was real and that it was a threat to their own liberties. If Southern slaveholders could suppress the right of petition in Congress, what else could they suppress? The Gag Rule did more to create anti-slavery sentiment in the North than 1,000 abolitionist speeches. It made the fight against slavery a fight for the rights of white Northerners, not just a fight for the freedom of black people, and that was a far more politically potent combination. Meanwhile, the abolitionist movement itself was becoming more organized and more visible. William Lloyd Garrison's newspaper, The Liberator, continued to publish. The American Anti-Slavery Society, founded in 1833, grew rapidly. Former enslaved people like Frederick Douglass became powerful speakers and writers, bringing the reality of slavery to Northern audiences in a way that abstract arguments never could. Douglass's autobiography, published in 1845, was a sensation. It detailed in vivid, unflinching prose the reality of life under slavery, the beatings, the degradation, the destruction of families, the absolute powerlessness of being owned by another person. It was impossible to read Douglass's narrative and maintain the comfortable fiction that slavery was benign. But let me stress again, in the 1840s, abolitionists were still a minority in the North. The real political energy was not around ending slavery where it existed. It was around preventing slavery from spreading into new territories. And the question of the territories was about to explode. In the 1840s, the United States embarked on a period of rapid territorial expansion that would reignite the slavery debate with a fury that made the Missouri Crisis look tame by comparison. It started with Texas. Texas had won its independence from Mexico in 1836 and had been an independent republic for nearly a decade. Texas wanted to join the United States, and many Americans, particularly Southerners, wanted to annex Texas. Texas was a slave territory. Bringing it into the Union would add another massive slave state. For that same reason, many Northerners opposed annexation. In 1845, Texas was annexed and admitted as a slave state, but the annexation also led to a dispute with Mexico over the border. President James K. Polk, a Tennessee slaveholder and an ardent expansionist, wanted more than just Texas. He wanted California, New Mexico, and everything in between. When diplomacy failed to get him what he wanted, Polk sent American troops to a disputed area along the Rio Grande, provoking a clash with Mexican forces. Polk then told Congress that Mexico had shed American blood on American soil and asked for a declaration of war. The Mexican-American War lasted from 1846 to 1848, and it was a lopsided American victory. Through the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, the United States acquired a staggering amount of territory, what would become California, Nevada, Utah, most of Arizona, and parts of New Mexico, Colorado, and Wyoming. It was one of the largest territorial acquisitions in American history. And immediately, the question was, would slavery be allowed in these new territories? Even before the war ended, a young Democratic congressman from Pennsylvania named David Wilmot introduced what became known as the Wilmot Proviso. This was a simple amendment to a spending bill that stated slavery would be prohibited in any territory acquired from Mexico. Wilmot was no abolitionist and no friend to black people. He explicitly said he wanted to preserve the new territories for the sons of toil, of my own race and own color. His proviso was about protecting free white labor, not about freeing enslaved people. The Wilmot Proviso passed the House of Representatives, where the North had a majority, but it failed in the Senate, where the balance between free and slave states gave the South an effective veto. The proviso was introduced again and again, and it failed again and again. But the debate it sparked was ferocious. Southern leaders were furious. They argued that the territories were the common property of all Americans and that slaveholders had just as much right to bring their property into the territories as anyone else. Northern leaders argued that slavery must not expand, that the new territories must be reserved for free labor. The Wilmot Proviso never passed, but it did something arguably more important. It split American politics along sectional lines in a way that had not happened before. Previously, the two major parties, the Democrats and the Whigs, had been national parties with supporters in both the North and the South. The debate over the Wilmot Proviso began to break those parties apart. Northern Democrats and Northern Whigs found themselves agreeing with each other against Southern Democrats and Southern Whigs. The old party lines were cracking, and sectional lines were hardening. The Mexican-American War, which was supposed to be a triumph of American expansion, had instead poured gasoline on the fire of the slavery debate. The country now had to decide what to do with hundreds of thousands of square miles of new territory, and neither side was willing to back down. By 1850, the United States was in genuine crisis. California, which had been flooded with settlers during the gold rush of 1849, was ready for statehood and wanted to enter the Union as a free state. But admitting California as a free state would break the balance in the Senate, giving the free states a majority. Southern leaders threatened secession if California was admitted without some major concession to the slave states. At the same time, there were a host of other territorial questions that needed answering. What about the rest of the land acquired from Mexico? What about slavery in the District of Columbia, the nation's capital, where enslaved people were bought and sold within sight of the Capitol building? What about the enforcement of the Fugitive Slave Clause, which many northern states were openly ignoring? Into this crisis stepped Henry Clay of Kentucky, the great compromiser. Clay was now in his early 70s and in failing health. He had brokered the Missouri Compromise 30 years earlier. He had helped resolve the Nullification Crisis. One more time, he would try to find common ground between North and South. Clay proposed a package of measures that became known as the Compromise of 1850. It was not a single law, but a series of 5 separate bills. Let me walk through the key provisions. First, California would be admitted as a free state. This was a significant victory for the North and the Free Soil movement. Second, the territories of New Mexico and Utah would be organized without any restriction on slavery. The question of whether slavery would be allowed would be decided by the settlers themselves when they applied for statehood. This principle was called popular sovereignty, and it would become enormously important and enormously controversial in the years to come. Third, the slave trade, but not slavery itself, would be abolished in the District of Columbia. Enslaved people could no longer be bought and sold in the nation's capital, but those already enslaved there would remain in bondage. Fourth, the boundary dispute between Texas and New Mexico would be resolved in New Mexico's favor, but Texas would receive $10 million in compensation, which it would use to pay off its debts from its time as a republic. And fifth, this was the big one, a new, much more aggressive Fugitive Slave Act would be passed. This is the provision that would have the most dramatic consequences for the future, so let me spend some time on it. The original Fugitive Slave Act, passed in 1793, had been poorly enforced. Many northern states had passed personal liberty laws that made it difficult for slave catchers to operate within their borders. Enslaved people who escaped to the north often found de facto freedom, even if the law technically required their return. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 changed all of that. Under the new law, federal commissioners were appointed in every county in the United States to hear cases involving alleged fugitives. These commissioners had the power to issue warrants for the arrest of accused runaways. Any federal marshal who refused to enforce the law could be fined $1,000. Any citizen who helped a fugitive or refused to assist in their capture could also be fined $1,000 and imprisoned for 6 months. The accused fugitive had no right to a jury trial and could not testify on their own behalf. And here is one of the most outrageous provisions. The commissioner who heard the case was paid $10 if he ruled in favor of the slaveholder and only $5 if he ruled in favor of the accused fugitive. The system was literally rigged to return people to slavery. The Compromise of 1850 was steered through Congress, not by Clay, who was too ill to manage the legislative process, but by Senator Stephen Douglas of Illinois, a young, ambitious Democrat who would play a central role in the events to come. The compromise passed. War was averted. For now. But the Compromise of 1850 did not actually solve anything. It merely delayed the crisis while simultaneously creating new sources of outrage. The Fugitive Slave Act, in particular, would prove to be one of the most consequential blunders in American political history. Rather than pacifying the North, it radicalized it. We are about to enter the most tumultuous decade in American history before the war itself. The 1850s would see one crisis after another, each one worse than the last, each one pushing the country closer to the edge. And the first of those crises was the direct result of the Compromise of 1850. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 was supposed to be a concession that would satisfy the South and preserve the peace. Instead, it became one of the most powerful recruiting tools the anti-slavery movement ever had. Because for the first time, the horror of slavery was not something that happened far away in the cotton fields of Mississippi. It was happening in the streets of Boston, Philadelphia, and New York. Under the new law, slave catchers fanned out across the northern states, pursuing formerly enslaved people who had been living freely for years, sometimes decades. They also kidnapped free black people, accusing them of being runaways. Because the accused had no right to testify or to a jury trial, it was almost impossible for a free black person to prove they were not someone's escaped property. The cases that resulted were explosive. Let me tell you about a few of them. In September of 1850, James Hamlet, a free black man living in New York City, was seized under the new law and accused of being a runaway from Maryland. He was brought before a commissioner, denied the right to speak in his own defense, and shipped back to Maryland within days. The black community in New York was outraged. They raised money to buy Hamlet's freedom, which they eventually did, but the case sent a chilling message: no black person in the North was safe. In February of 1851, a man named Shadrach Minkins was arrested in Boston as an alleged fugitive from Virginia. A group of black Bostonians stormed the courthouse, rescued Minkins, and spirited him away to Canada via the Underground Railroad. The federal government was furious. President Millard Fillmore ordered the prosecution of the rescuers, but Boston juries refused to convict them. And then there was the case of Anthony Burns. In May of 1854, Burns, who had escaped from slavery in Virginia, was arrested in Boston. The reaction in Boston was extraordinary. Thousands of people gathered outside the courthouse to protest. A group attempted to storm the building to rescue Burns, and in the ensuing violence, a federal deputy marshal was killed. President Franklin Pierce sent federal troops to Boston to ensure that Burns was returned to Virginia. On June 2nd, Burns was marched through the streets of Boston to the harbor, surrounded by over 1,000 federal soldiers with bayonets and loaded cannons. 50,000 Bostonians lined the streets, many of them weeping, some of them holding signs that read "shame" and displaying American flags upside down as a sign of distress. Buildings along the route were draped in black fabric. Church bells tolled as if for a funeral. The cost of returning Anthony Burns to Virginia was estimated at $100,000. $100,000 spent by the federal government to return one man to slavery. And the spectacle of it, federal soldiers marching a man to bondage through the streets of a city that prided itself on being the cradle of liberty, radicalized thousands of Northerners who had previously been content to look the other way. On slavery. After the Burns case, personal liberty laws proliferated across the North. These state laws did everything possible to obstruct the enforcement of the Fugitive Slave Act. Some required jury trials for accused fugitives. Others prohibited state officials from assisting in the capture of runaways. Others provided legal counsel for accused fugitives at state expense. The South was furious. They saw these personal liberty laws as a blatant violation of federal law and the Constitution. And they were right, technically. But the North had reached a point where enforcing a law they found morally abhorrent was no longer something they were willing to do. The Fugitive Slave Act was supposed to strengthen the bonds of union. It shattered them instead. While the Fugitive Slave Act was provoking real-world crises, a book was published that would do more to shape Northern opinion on slavery than any political event. In 1852, Harriet Beecher Stowe published Uncle Tom's Cabin. Stowe was the daughter of a prominent minister and the wife of a theology professor. She was not an activist or a politician. She was a writer and a mother who was moved by the Fugitive Slave Act to put into words the human reality of slavery. She later said that the book came to her almost in a vision while she was sitting in church, that she did not write it so much as it was written through her. Uncle Tom's Cabin told the story of enslaved people and their families, their love, their suffering, their humanity. It followed the saintly Uncle Tom as he was sold away from his family and eventually beaten to death by a cruel overseer. It followed Eliza as she fled across the frozen Ohio River with her child in her arms to escape a slave trader. It depicted slavery not as an abstract political issue, but as a daily reality of human cruelty and suffering. The impact was staggering. Uncle Tom's Cabin sold 300,000 copies in its first year in the United States alone. It was translated into dozens of languages and became a global phenomenon. It was adapted into plays that were performed across the North, drawing huge audiences. For millions of Northerners who had never seen a plantation, never encountered an enslaved person, the book was their first encounter with the human cost of slavery. Southern reaction was exactly what you would expect. They denounced the book as libelous propaganda, a grossly exaggerated and unfair portrayal of Southern life. Southern writers published dozens of response novels, portraying slavery as benevolent and idyllic, but none of those response novels had anywhere near the cultural impact of Stowe's work. There is a famous, probably apocryphal, story that when Abraham Lincoln met Harriet Beecher Stowe during the Civil War, he greeted her by saying, "So you are the little woman who wrote the book that started this great war." Whether or not Lincoln actually said that, the sentiment captures something real. Uncle Tom's Cabin did not start the war, but it changed the way millions of people thought about slavery. It gave the anti-slavery cause a human face and an emotional power that political arguments alone could never have achieved. If the Fugitive Slave Act radicalized the North, the Kansas-Nebraska Act blew the political system apart, and the man responsible for it was one of the most talented and ambitious politicians in American history, a man who thought he was being clever and ended up helping to destroy the country. His name was Stephen A. Douglas, the Democratic senator from Illinois. Douglas was a small man, just over 5 feet tall, with enormous energy and outsized ambition. He wanted to be president, and he wanted to build a transcontinental railroad, and he believed that the key to both goals was opening the vast territory west of Missouri and Iowa for settlement. The problem was that this territory, the Nebraska Territory, as it was called, was north of the Missouri Compromise line. Under the terms of the 1820 Compromise, slavery was prohibited there. Southern senators would never vote to organize the territory without some concession on the slavery question. Without Southern votes, the territory could not be organized. Without organizing the territory, Douglas could not get his railroad. So Douglas proposed what became the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. The bill divided the Nebraska Territory into two parts: Kansas, which bordered the slave state of Missouri, and Nebraska, which was further north. The bill applied the principle of popular sovereignty to both territories, meaning that the settlers themselves would decide whether to allow slavery. And here was the bombshell to make this work. The bill explicitly repealed the Missouri Compromise line. The prohibition on slavery north of 3630 was gone, done. After 34 years, the agreement that had maintained the peace was torn up. Douglas thought this was a reasonable solution. Let the people decide, he argued. Democracy in action. He dramatically underestimated the reaction in the North. The Kansas-Nebraska Act provoked an explosion of outrage across the northern states. The Missouri Compromise had been regarded in the North as a sacred compact, an agreement that both sides had honored for over 3 decades. Repealing it felt like a betrayal of the worst kind. It was proof, many Northerners believed, that the slave power would never be satisfied, that no agreement would be honored, that the slaveholders would keep pushing and pushing and pushing until slavery covered the entire continent. The political consequences were immediate and seismic. The Whig Party, which had been one of the 2 major political parties for 20 years, collapsed. The Whigs had been a national party with supporters in both the North and South, but the Kansas-Nebraska Act destroyed whatever common ground still existed between Northern and Southern Whigs. The party simply ceased to exist as a national force. In its place, a new party emerged. In 1854, Anti-slavery Whigs, anti-slavery Democrats, and Free Soilers came together to form the Republican Party. The Republicans were explicitly a Northern party. They had virtually no support in the South. Their core principle was simple: slavery must not be allowed to expand into the territories. They did not call for the abolition of slavery where it already existed that was still too radical for most voters, but they were firmly, unequivocally opposed to its expansion. The creation of the Republican Party was one of the most important events in American political history. For the first time, a major political party was organized around opposition to slavery's expansion. For the first time, one of the two major parties had essentially no presence in an entire region of the country. The party system, which had served as a bridge between North and South, was breaking down. And without that bridge, the two sections were drifting further and further apart. Stephen Douglas had wanted to build a railroad. Instead, he had helped build the road to civil war. If the Kansas-Nebraska Act was the match, Kansas was the powder keg. Under the principle of popular sovereignty, the question of whether Kansas would be free or slave would be decided by the settlers, and so both sides sent settlers. Pro-slavery Missourians, known as border ruffians, crossed into Kansas to vote illegally and to intimidate free state settlers. Anti-slavery organizations in the North, most notably the New England Emigrant Aid Company, sent their own settlers to Kansas to ensure the territory entered the Union as a free state. The result was a miniature civil war. Armed gangs roamed the territory. Pro-slavery forces sacked the free state town of Lawrence in May of 1856, destroying a hotel, a newspaper office, and several homes. In retaliation, a man named John Brown, a fierce, religiously driven abolitionist who believed he was an instrument of God's vengeance, led a small group to Pottawatomie Creek. There, in the dead of night, they dragged 5 pro-slavery settlers from their homes and hacked them to death with broadswords. The violence in Kansas horrified the nation. It also gave both sides martyrs and villains. In the North, the sacking of Lawrence was portrayed as proof of Southern barbarism. In the South, the Pottawatomie Massacre was proof of Northern fanaticism. Both sides used Kansas to raise money, recruit supporters, and harden their positions. The Kansas situation dragged on for years. A fraudulent pro-slavery constitution was written, rejected, rewritten, and rejected again. The territory would not be admitted as a free state until January of 1861, after the southern states had already begun seceding. Kansas earned its nickname Bleeding Kansas, and it earned every letter of it. What Bleeding Kansas demonstrated was something terrifying. Popular sovereignty did not work. When you told people to vote on whether human beings could be owned as property, you did not get a peaceful democratic process. You got violence. You got fraud. You got murder. The idea that the slavery question could be resolved through local democracy was a fantasy, and Kansas proved it. Bleeding Kansas produced one of the most shocking acts of political violence in American history, and it did not happen in Kansas. It happened on the floor of the United States Senate. On May 19th and 20th of 1856, Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts delivered a blistering speech he called "The Crime Against Kansas." Sumner was tall, imposing, and eloquent, and he did not pull his punches. He attacked the pro-slavery forces in Kansas in scorching terms. But he also made the speech deeply personal, singling out several Southern senators for ridicule, particularly Senator Andrew Butler of South Carolina, whom Sumner mocked as a doddering old fool who had taken the harlot, slavery, as his mistress. 2 days later, on May 22nd, Preston Brooks, a congressman from South Carolina and a relative of Butler, walked into the Senate chamber carrying a metal-tipped cane. He approached Sumner, who was sitting at his desk, and without warning began beating him over the head. Sumner, trapped behind his desk, tried to rise, tearing the desk from its bolted position on the floor. Brooks continued to beat him, blow after blow, until the cane broke. Sumner collapsed, bloody and unconscious. The beating was so severe that Sumner could not return to the Senate for over 3 years. He suffered from what we would today probably diagnose as traumatic brain injury and severe post-traumatic stress. His empty desk in the Senate chamber became a powerful symbol for the North, a silent reminder of Southern brutality. The reactions in the North and South were revealing. In the North, the attack was seen as an outrage, proof that the slave power would resort to violence against anyone who dared to criticize it. Sumner became a martyr. His "crime against Kansas" speech, which probably would have been forgotten otherwise, was reprinted over 1 million times. In the South, Brooks became a hero. He received dozens of new canes from admirers, many inscribed with messages like "Hit him again." Southern newspapers praised his actions. The House of Representatives voted on whether to expel Brooks. The vote fell short of the required 2/3 majority because Southern members voted almost unanimously to keep him. Think about what this meant. A member of Congress had walked onto the floor of the United States Senate and beaten another member unconscious with a weapon, and half the country celebrated it. The caning of Charles Sumner was not just an act of violence. It was a symbol of how far apart the two sections of the country had drifted. They could no longer even maintain basic civility toward each other. The political system was breaking down, and the violence was not confined to the frontier anymore. It was in the halls of government itself. As if bleeding Kansas and the caning of Charles Sumner were not enough, 1857 brought what many historians consider the single worst Supreme Court decision in American history. The case was Dred Scott Sanford, and its consequences were devastating. Dred Scott was an enslaved man from Missouri. His owner, an army surgeon named John Emerson, had taken Scott with him to postings in Illinois, a free state, and the Wisconsin Territory, where slavery was prohibited under the Missouri Compromise. Scott lived in free territory for several years before returning to Missouri with his owner. After Emerson died, Scott sued for his freedom, arguing that his residence in free territory had made him free. The case wound through the courts for years before reaching the Supreme Court. The Chief Justice was Roger B. Taney, a 79-year-old Marylander who had been appointed by Andrew Jackson. Taney was a supporter of slavery, and he saw the Dred Scott case as an opportunity to settle the slavery question once and for all in the South's favor. The decision, handed down on March 6, 1857, went far beyond the specifics of Scott's case. Taney's majority opinion made 3 sweeping declarations. First, Taney ruled that black people, whether enslaved or free, were not and could never be citizens of the United States. He wrote that at the time of the founding, black people were regarded as beings of an inferior order and altogether unfit to associate with the white race, either in social or political relations, and so far inferior that they had no rights which the white man was bound to respect. Those words, "no rights which the white man was bound to respect," became some of the most infamous in American legal history. Second, Taney ruled that the Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional. Congress, he said, had no power to prohibit slavery in the territories. Slaveholders had a constitutional right, under the Fifth Amendment's protection of property, to take their property, including enslaved people, into any territory of the United States. This meant that popular sovereignty was also unconstitutional. No territorial government could ban slavery either. Third, because Scott was not a citizen, he had no standing to bring a lawsuit. The case should never have been heard in the first place. The Dred Scott decision was supposed to end the slavery debate. It made it infinitely worse. Republicans were outraged. The decision invalidated their entire platform. If Congress could not prohibit slavery in the territories, then the Republican Party's core principle was unconstitutional. Lincoln argued that the decision was part of a conspiracy to nationalize slavery to make it legal everywhere in the United States, not just in the South. He warned that the next step would be another Supreme Court decision ruling that no state could ban slavery either. For free black people, the decision was a thunderbolt. The highest court in the land had declared that they had no rights, that they were not and could never be Americans. Frederick Douglass responded with characteristic fire, calling the decision a judicial lie. and predicting that it would ultimately hasten the end of slavery by exposing its fundamental injustice. The Dred Scott decision destroyed whatever remained of the political center. Moderates who had hoped for compromise found the ground crumbling beneath their feet. The Supreme Court had essentially declared that slavery could go anywhere and that Congress was powerless to stop it. For those in the North who still hoped that the political process could resolve the slavery question, Dred Scott was a devastating blow. In the midst of all of this crisis, a series of debates in Illinois would introduce the nation to the man who would ultimately lead it through its greatest trial. In 1858, Abraham Lincoln challenged the incumbent Stephen Douglas for the United States Senate seat from Illinois. Lincoln was a former one-term congressman and a successful lawyer, but he was not yet a national figure. Douglas, by contrast, was one of the most famous politicians in America, the author of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and a leading candidate for the Democratic presidential nomination in 1860. The two men agreed to a series of 7 debates held across Illinois during the fall of 1858. These debates drew enormous crowds and were covered extensively by newspapers across the country. They remain some of the most significant political debates in American history, not because of their entertainment value, but because they laid bare the fundamental question that the nation could no longer avoid. Douglas's position was built around popular sovereignty. Let the people of each territory decide for themselves whether to allow slavery. It was a democratic solution, he argued, and it respected local self-governance. Douglas did not care whether slavery was voted up or down. He cared about the process. He famously said he did not care whether slavery was voted down or voted up. What mattered was that the people had chosen. Lincoln's position was more nuanced and, ultimately, more morally grounded. Lincoln said he did not propose to interfere with slavery where it already existed. He knew the Constitution protected it in the existing slave states, and he was a lawyer who respected constitutional constraints, but he was absolutely opposed to the expansion of slavery into new territories. And crucially, Lincoln articulated something that Douglas would not, that slavery was morally wrong. In the debate at Ottawa, Lincoln declared, "There is no reason in the world why the Negro is not entitled to all the natural rights enumerated in the Declaration of Independence, the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." He went on to say that slavery was a vast moral evil that the founders had intended to put on the path to ultimate extinction. Lincoln pressed Douglas on the tension between popular sovereignty and the Dred Scott decision. If the Supreme Court had ruled that Congress could not ban slavery in the territories, how could a territorial legislature do so? Douglas's answer, which became known as the Freeport Doctrine, was that, regardless of what the Supreme Court said, slavery could not survive in any territory where the local government refused to pass laws protecting it. If the settlers did not want slavery, they simply would not create the legal framework it needed to exist. This answer helped Douglas win re-election to the Senate, but it was a catastrophic blunder at the national level. The Freeport Doctrine enraged the South. Southern leaders argued that slaveholders had a constitutional right, as affirmed by the Supreme Court, to bring their property into any territory, and that territorial governments were obligated to protect that property. Douglas's suggestion that local settlers could effectively nullify this right by refusing to act was unacceptable to the South. The Freeport Doctrine cost Douglas the support of Southern Democrats, which would have devastating consequences in the presidential election of 1860. Lincoln lost the Senate race, but he won something more valuable. The debates made him a national figure. His clear, principled articulation of the anti-slavery position resonated with Republicans across the North. He would not remain a private citizen for long. If there is one event that captures the mood of the country on the eve of the Civil War, it is John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry. We have already met John Brown in Kansas, where he led the Pottawatomie Massacre. After Kansas, Brown went underground, planning something far more ambitious. He intended to strike at the heart of slavery itself. Brown's plan was audacious to the point of madness. He would lead a small, armed force to seize the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, which contained thousands of weapons. He would distribute those weapons to enslaved people in the surrounding area, sparking a massive slave rebellion that would spread across the South and destroy the institution of slavery by force. On the night of October 16, 1859, Brown and a band of 21 men, 16 white, 5 black, crossed the Potomac River and seized the arsenal. The first part of the plan worked. They took the arsenal and several hostages. But the rebellion Brown expected never materialized. The enslaved population in the area did not rise up. Local militia surrounded the arsenal, and within 2 days, a company of United States Marines under the command of Colonel Robert E. Lee, that Robert E. Lee stormed the engine house where Brown and his remaining men were barricaded. Brown was wounded and captured. 10 of his men were killed. Brown was quickly tried for treason, conspiracy, and murder. The trial was rushed, lasting only about a week. Brown, who was injured and unable to stand, defended himself with remarkable eloquence. He told the court that he had acted in accordance with God's will, that the Bible taught him to remember them that are in bonds, as bound with them. He accepted his fate with eerie calm. On December 2, 1859, John Brown was hanged. His last words, written on a note he handed to a guard, read, "I, John Brown, am now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away but with blood." The reaction to Brown's raid and execution exposed the chasm between North and South in the starkest possible terms. In the South, the raid confirmed every fear about Northern intentions. Southerners believed that abolitionists wanted to incite slave rebellions, to bring fire and massacre to Southern homes. They pointed to the fact that Brown had received financial support from wealthy Northern abolitionists, the so-called Secret Six. If prominent Northerners were willing to fund an armed attack on Southern soil, what would they do if they gained control of the federal government? In the North, the reaction was more complex. Many Northerners condemned the raid as foolish and illegal. Lincoln himself called it wrong. But as Brown's execution approached, the tone shifted. Brown's composure, his eloquence at trial, his willingness to die for his convictions, these qualities transformed him in many Northern eyes from a violent extremist into a martyr. Henry David Thoreau compared Brown to Christ. Ralph Waldo Emerson said Brown would make the gallows glorious like the cross. Church bells tolled across the North on the day of his execution. Brown's body was barely cold before Northerners were singing John Brown's Body as a hymn. Harper's Ferry made compromise psychologically impossible. The South looked at the North and saw a region that celebrated a man who had tried to incite slave rebellion. The North looked at the South and saw a region so committed to slavery that it would execute a man for trying to free people from bondage. Each side saw the other as fundamentally alien, fundamentally hostile, and fundamentally unreasonable. The country was one election away from war. The presidential election of 1860 was the final act in the long tragedy that led to the Civil War. It was an election in which the two-party system, which had helped hold the nation together for decades, shattered completely. The Democrats held their nominating convention in Charleston, South Carolina, in April of 1860. This was a disaster from the start. The frontrunner was Stephen Douglas, the champion of popular sovereignty. But Southern Democrats demanded that the party platform include a plank calling for a federal slave code for the territories, essentially, a law requiring the federal government to protect slavery in every territory. Douglas and his Northern supporters refused. Without such a plank, most of the Southern delegations walked out. The convention adjourned without nominating a candidate. The Democrats tried again in Baltimore in June. Again, the Southern delegates walked out. The remaining delegates nominated Douglas. The Southern Democrats held their own convention and nominated John C. Breckinridge of Kentucky, the current vice president, on a platform demanding federal protection of slavery in the territories. A fourth party, the Constitutional Union Party, nominated John Bell of Tennessee on a platform that simply called for the preservation of the Union and the enforcement of the Constitution, without taking a specific position on slavery. It was a last, desperate attempt at compromise. And then there were the Republicans. They met in Chicago in May and nominated Abraham Lincoln of Illinois. Lincoln was chosen in part because he was seen as a moderate, more conservative than the leading candidate, William Seward of New York, who was perceived as too radical on the slavery question. The Republican platform called for the prohibition of slavery in the territories, a protective tariff, a Homestead Act, and federal support for a transcontinental railroad. It did not call for the abolition of slavery in the states where it already existed. The election itself was, in effect, two separate elections. In the North, the contest was between Lincoln and Douglas. In the South, it was between Breckinridge and Bell. Lincoln was not even on the ballot in most Southern states. On November 6, 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected the 16th President of the United States. He won with just under 40% of the popular vote, but he carried every free state except New Jersey, which he split with Douglas. He did not receive a single electoral vote from a slave state. He did not need to. Lincoln's election was the trigger for secession, but it is essential to understand why. Lincoln had not promised to abolish slavery. He had not threatened to interfere with slavery in the South. He had explicitly said he would not do so, but he had said that slavery was morally wrong and that it must not be allowed to spread. For the South, that was enough. If slavery could not expand, it would eventually be surrounded by free states. The political power of the slave states would decline as new free states were admitted. Eventually, the free states would have enough power to amend the Constitution and abolish slavery altogether. Southern leaders looked at Lincoln's election and saw the writing on the wall. The slave power, which had dominated the federal government for most of the nation's history, was losing its grip. The Three-Fifths Compromise, the Missouri Compromise, the Compromise of 1850, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, even the Dred Scott decision, none of it had been enough to permanently secure slavery's future. And now a president had been elected on an explicitly anti-slavery platform, without a single Southern electoral vote, proving that the South no longer had the political power to choose who governed the nation. For the men who led the South, this was an unacceptable situation. They would not wait to see what Lincoln might do. They would act first. On December 20th, 1860, just 6 weeks after Lincoln's election, South Carolina became the first state to secede from the United States. The secession convention in Charleston voted unanimously 169-0 to dissolve the state's connection to the Union. The declaration they issued left no ambiguity about their reasons. South Carolina cited the failure of northern states to enforce the Fugitive Slave Act, the election of a president whose opinions and purposes are hostile to slavery, and the threat that the new administration posed to the property, peace, and security of the slave states. South Carolina did not act alone for long. Within 6 weeks, 6 more states had seceded: Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. These were the states of the Deep South, the states with the highest concentrations of enslaved people and the greatest economic dependence on slavery. Their secession was not cautious or reluctant. It was enthusiastic. In many of these states, the secession conventions were dominated by the largest slaveholders and their political allies. The states that seceded issued declarations of causes explaining their decision. These documents are among the most important primary sources for understanding why the Civil War happened, because they let the secessionists speak for themselves. And what they said, over and over again, was slavery. Mississippi's declaration stated, "Our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest of the world." It went on to list northern offenses against slavery and concluded that secession was necessary to protect this institution. Georgia's declaration spent page after page detailing the history of the slavery controversy, arguing that the North had nullified the fugitive slave law in almost every free state in the Union, and that the prohibition of slavery in the territories is the cardinal principle of this organization, referring to the Republican Party. Texas's declaration was even more explicit. It stated that the federal government had been established exclusively by the white race, for themselves and their posterity, and that the African race had been rightfully held and regarded as an inferior and dependent race, and in that condition only could their existence in this country be rendered beneficial or tolerable. Texas declared that any government that denied the beneficent and patriarchal system of African slavery was a government that the state could not submit to. In February of 1861, the seceded states formed the Confederate States of America. They chose Jefferson Davis of Mississippi as their president. A constitution was drafted for the new nation, and it was remarkably similar to the United States Constitution with one critical difference. It explicitly and permanently protected the institution of slavery. The Confederate Constitution prohibited the Confederate Congress from passing any law denying or impairing the right of property in Negro slaves. It guaranteed that slavery would be protected in any territory the Confederacy might acquire. A month later, Alexander Stephens, the vice president of the Confederacy, delivered what has become known as the Cornerstone Speech. In this speech, Stephens declared that the Confederacy was founded on the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery, subordination to the superior race, is his natural and normal condition. He called this the cornerstone of the new government. I bring up these documents and these speeches not to belabor the point, but because there is a persistent myth that the Civil War was not really about slavery, that it was about tariffs or states' rights or some other more palatable cause. The people who actually seceded, the leaders of the Confederacy, told you exactly why they were doing it. They told you in their declarations. They told you in their Constitution. They told you in their speeches. They were protecting slavery. That is what they said. That is what they meant. We should take them at their word. While the southern states were seceding, the President of the United States was James Buchanan, and Buchanan's response to the crisis was, to put it charitably, inadequate. Buchanan was a Northern Democrat who owed his election largely to Southern support. He was sympathetic to the South and had spent his presidency trying to appease Southern leaders. When the secession crisis hit, Buchanan was paralyzed. In his annual message to Congress in December of 1860, he blamed the crisis on the North, specifically on the intemperate interference of the Northern people with the question of slavery in the Southern states. He then declared that while secession was illegal, the federal government had no constitutional authority to prevent it. Think about that for a moment. The President of the United States said that states could not legally leave the Union, but that he could not do anything to stop them from doing so. It was a position that satisfied no one. Northerners were outraged by his passivity. Southerners were encouraged by his weakness. During the long winter between Lincoln's election in November and his inauguration in March, Buchanan watched as federal property across the South arsenals, forts, customs, houses, and post offices was seized by seceding states. He did almost nothing. The military was in disarray. The cabinet was divided, with some members openly sympathetic to secession. Several resigned to join the Confederacy. It was the most dangerous period of governmental paralysis in American history. Various compromise proposals were floated during this period. The most significant was the Crittenden Compromise, proposed by Senator John Crittenden of Kentucky. The plan called for a constitutional amendment permanently protecting slavery in all states where it currently existed, restoring the Missouri Compromise line and extending it to the Pacific, and guaranteeing the enforcement of the Fugitive Slave Act. It was, essentially, a total capitulation to Southern demands on every point except the territories already north of the line. Lincoln, who was not yet in office but was the leader of the Republican Party, rejected the Crittenden Compromise. He was willing to guarantee that the federal government would not interfere with slavery in the existing slave states, which was already his stated position. But he would not agree to the extension of slavery into any new territories. That was the core principle of the Republican Party, the issue on which he had been elected, and he would not surrender it. On that point, hold firm, as with a chain of steel, Lincoln wrote to a Republican ally. The Crittenden Compromise failed. So did every other proposed compromise. The window for a political solution was closing. By the time Lincoln was inaugurated on March 4th, 1861, 7 states had already left the Union and formed a new nation. Lincoln's inauguration on March 4th, 1861, took place under the shadow of secession, threats of assassination, and open talk of civil war. The new president had traveled to Washington by a circuitous route, passing through Baltimore, where he was warned of an assassination plot in disguise in the middle of the night. It was not an auspicious beginning. In his inaugural address, Lincoln struck a careful balance. He firmly denied the legality of secession. He pledged to enforce federal law in all states. But he also offered an olive branch, repeating his promise not to interfere with slavery where it existed and expressing his hope for a peaceful resolution. He closed with one of the most beautiful passages in American political oratory. We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection. The mystic cords of memory, stretching from every battlefield and patriot grave to every living heart and hearthstone all over this broad land, will yet swell the chorus of the Union, when again touched, as surely they will be, by the better angels of our nature. But words alone could not resolve the crisis. Lincoln inherited an impossible situation, and its most acute manifestation was a small federal fort in the harbor of Charleston, South Carolina. Fort Sumter was one of a handful of federal installations in the seceded states that had not been surrendered. It was garrisoned by a small force of about 85 soldiers under the command of Major Robert Anderson, a Kentucky-born officer who was loyal to the Union. The garrison was running low on supplies. If they were not resupplied, they would have to evacuate. If Lincoln sent supplies, the Confederacy would almost certainly see it as an act of aggression and attack the fort. Lincoln was caught between 2 unacceptable options. If he abandoned the fort, it would be seen as recognition of the Confederacy's legitimacy. The remaining slave states that had not yet seceded, Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas, might take it as a signal that the federal government was too weak to resist secession, and they might join the Confederacy. Northern public opinion would turn against Lincoln for showing weakness. On the other hand, if he sent warships and troops to reinforce the fort, it would look like the North was the aggressor, starting a war against the South. That could push the border states into the Confederacy and undermine Northern public support. Lincoln chose a third option. He would send supplies food only, no weapons or reinforcements, and he would notify the Confederate government in advance that he was doing so. This was a calculated move of enormous political skill. If the Confederacy allowed the supplies through, the crisis would be diffused temporarily. If the Confederacy fired on unarmed supply ships or on the fort itself, they would be the aggressors, and Lincoln would have the moral high ground to rally the North. Jefferson Davis and the Confederate leadership understood the trap, but they could not allow the fort to be resupplied. Doing so would make the Confederacy look weak and would undermine the argument that the Southern states were truly independent. And so Davis ordered the bombardment of Fort Sumter. At 4:30 in the morning on April 12, 1861, Confederate batteries ringing Charleston Harbor opened fire on Fort Sumter. The bombardment lasted 34 hours. The fort was pounded by an estimated 4,000 shells. The barracks caught fire. The flagstaff was shot away. Major Anderson and his men, outgunned and out of supplies, held on for as long as they could before finally surrendering on April 13th. Remarkably, no one was killed during the bombardment itself, though 2 Union soldiers died in an accident during the surrender ceremony. The bloodless nature of the battle gave many Americans the illusion that the coming war would be short and relatively painless. They could not have been more wrong. The attack on Fort Sumter electrified the North. Whatever divisions had existed between Republicans and Democrats, between abolitionists and conservatives, between those who wanted war and those who wanted peace were swept away in a surge of patriotic fury. The flag had been fired upon. The nation had been attacked. Lincoln immediately called for 75,000 volunteers to put down the rebellion. The response was overwhelming. More men volunteered than could be equipped. But Lincoln's call for troops had a devastating consequence. The border slave states that had refused to secede now faced a choice: send troops to fight against their southern brethren or join the Confederacy. Virginia, the most populous and prestigious of the slave states, seceded on April 17th. Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina followed within weeks. The Confederacy now included 11 states with a combined white population of about 5.5 million and an enslaved population of nearly 3.5 million. 4 slave states, Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri, remained in the Union, though their loyalty was uncertain and would be tested throughout the war. Keeping these border states in the Union was one of Lincoln's most delicate political challenges. "I hope to have God on my side," Lincoln reportedly said, "but I must have Kentucky." The war had begun. The great peace of the American experiment was shattered. What followed would be 4 years of carnage that would kill more Americans than any other conflict in the nation's history, transform the meaning of American freedom, and leave scars that have never fully healed. Now that we have walked through the entire story, from the Constitutional Convention to Fort Sumter, let us step back and answer the question plainly. What caused the American Civil War? The answer, based on everything we have discussed, is slavery. Slavery was the cause of the Civil War. Not the only factor, but the central, fundamental, indispensable cause without which there would have been no war. I know that statement might seem obvious to some and controversial to others. The lost cause narrative, which emerged in the decades after the war and was promoted by former Confederates and their descendants, argued that the war was really about states' rights, or tariffs, or differing interpretations of the Constitution, or northern aggression, or cultural differences, anything except slavery. This narrative was enormously successful. For over a century, it shaped how the Civil War was taught in schools, portrayed in films, and understood by millions of Americans. But the lost cause narrative does not survive contact with the primary sources. We do not have to guess about why the southern states seceded. They told us. In their declarations of causes, in their constitutional provisions, and in the speeches of their leaders, they said it was about slavery, over and over and over again. Every crisis we have discussed, Missouri, the Nullification fight, the gag rule, Texas, the Mexican War, the Compromise of 1850, the Fugitive Slave Act, Kansas-Nebraska, Bleeding Kansas, Dred Scott, Harper's Ferry, the election of 1860. Every single one of these was about slavery or directly connected to it. Remove slavery from the equation, and none of these crises happen. Remove slavery, and there is no Missouri Compromise, no Wilmot Proviso, no Fugitive Slave Act, no Republican Party, no secession, and no Fort Sumter. Was the war about states' rights? Only in the narrow sense that the right in question was the right to own enslaved people. The South did not care about states' rights as a general principle. When northern states passed personal liberty laws asserting their state sovereignty against the Fugitive Slave Act, the South demanded that the federal government override those laws. When the Dred Scott decision nationalized slaveholders' property rights, overriding the sovereignty of free states and territories, the South cheered. The South wanted states' rights when states' rights protected slavery, and they wanted federal power when federal power protected slavery. It was never about the abstract principle of state sovereignty. It was about preserving the institution that their entire society was built upon. Was the war about tariffs? Tariffs were a real area of disagreement between North and South, and they had been for decades. But by the 1850s, tariffs were a secondary issue. The tariff had been low throughout the 1850s, and the South was not seceding over trade policy. None of the secession declarations mentioned tariffs as a primary cause. The moral tariff, which is sometimes cited as a cause, was not even passed until March of 1861 after 7 states had already seceded. Was the war about economic differences between North and South? Absolutely. But those economic differences were rooted in, you guessed it, slavery. The Southern economy was built on enslaved labor. The Northern economy was built on free labor. The conflict between these two systems was a conflict about slavery. Was the war about cultural differences? Yes, but again, those cultural differences were shaped by slavery. The hierarchical, agrarian, conservative society of the South was a direct product of the slave system. The more egalitarian, commercial, reform-minded culture of the North developed in the absence of large-scale slavery. You cannot separate Southern culture from the institution of slavery. They were the same thing. Let me spend a bit more time on the states' rights argument because it is so persistent and so misleading. The idea that the South was fighting for states' rights, for the noble principle of local self-governance against an overreaching federal government, is one of the most enduring myths in American history. It is a myth that was deliberately constructed after the war by former Confederates who wanted to reframe their cause in more sympathetic terms. Here is the reality. Before the war, the South was perfectly happy to use federal power when it served their interests. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 was one of the most aggressive exercises of federal power in American history up to that point. It required northern states to use their resources to capture and return enslaved people. It overrode northern state laws. It denied accused fugitives basic legal protections, and the South demanded its enforcement. When northern states resisted through personal liberty laws and exercise of states' rights, if there ever was one, the South denounced them. The Dred Scott decision was another example. In that ruling, the Supreme Court declared that no state or territory could prohibit slavery. This was a direct assault on the sovereignty of free states and territories, and the South celebrated it. The Confederate Constitution itself undermines the states' rights argument. While it gave Confederate states some additional autonomy in certain areas, it also prohibited any Confederate state from ever abolishing slavery. Let me say that again. Under the Confederate Constitution, a Confederate state did not have the right to end slavery within its own borders. If the Confederacy was truly about states' rights, why would it strip its member states of the right to make their own decision about the most important political question of the era? The answer is that the Confederacy was not about states' rights. It was about slavery. States' rights was the vehicle, not the destination. Having said all of that, I do not want to leave you with the impression that the Civil War was simple. History is never simple. While slavery was the central cause, there were real economic tensions between North and South that went beyond slavery and contributed to the sense that the two regions were fundamentally incompatible. The tariff question was real. Northern manufacturers wanted protection from foreign competition. Southern planters, who exported their crops and imported manufactured goods, wanted free trade. This was a genuine economic disagreement that produced real resentment. Internal improvements, what we would today call infrastructure spending, were another point of contention. The North wanted federal investment in roads, canals, and railroads to support commerce and manufacturing. Many Southerners opposed federal spending on internal improvements, partly because they feared the expansion of federal power, and partly because their agricultural economy benefited less from such projects. The question of Western lands was about more than just slavery. Northern farmers and workers wanted access to cheap land in the West through homestead legislation. Southern planters wanted access to the same land for the expansion of plantation agriculture. These competing visions for the West were bound up with the slavery question, but they also reflected broader economic tensions. Banking and currency policy divided the sections as well. The North generally favored a stronger national banking system and a more stable currency to support commerce. Many Southerners preferred a more decentralized financial system. These economic disagreements were real, and they mattered, but they were the kind of disagreements that political systems are designed to handle. Tariff rates can be adjusted. Infrastructure spending can be negotiated. Banking policy can be reformed. None of these issues, on their own, would have led to a civil war. What made them intractable was that they were layered on top of the slavery question, which was the one issue that could not be compromised. The final piece of the puzzle is the breakdown of the political system itself. For decades, the American political system managed to contain the slavery question through a series of compromises, the Missouri Compromise, the Compromise of 1850, and others. These compromises did not resolve the underlying issue, but they bought time and prevented immediate catastrophe. By the 1850s, the system's ability to compromise had been exhausted. There are several reasons for this. First, the political parties that had served as bridges between North and South collapsed. The Whig Party died over the Kansas-Nebraska Act. The Democratic Party fractured along sectional lines, as we saw in the 1860 election. Without national parties that forced politicians to work across sectional lines, there was no institutional mechanism for compromise. Second, the terms of the debate had shifted in ways that made compromise impossible. In the early republic, the question had been about managing slavery where it could expand, how it would be counted for representation, and how fugitives would be returned. By the 1850s, the question had become existential. The South demanded not just the right to maintain slavery where it existed, but the right to expand it everywhere and the obligation of the federal government to protect it. The North demanded that slavery be contained and put on the path to ultimate extinction. There was no middle ground between these positions. Third, violence had poisoned the political atmosphere. Bleeding Kansas, the caning of Sumner, Harper's Ferry, these events convinced each side that the other was not just wrong, but dangerous. When political opponents become enemies, when disagreement becomes perceived as a threat to survival, compromise becomes surrender, and no one is willing to surrender. Fourth, leadership failed. There were talented politicians on both sides, but none of them was able to find a way through the crisis. Henry Clay and Daniel Webster, the great compromisers of an earlier era, were dead. Their successors, Douglas, Buchanan, Davis, were either too rigid, too weak, or too committed to their own section to bridge the gap. And fifth, there was the simple, brutal truth that some issues cannot be compromised. Slavery was one of those issues. Either human beings could be owned as property, or they could not. Either slavery would expand, or it would not. Either the South would be allowed to build a society based on racial subjugation, or it would not. These were binary questions, and the political system, which was designed to handle questions of degree, could not handle questions of kind. So why did the American Civil War happen? It happened because the United States was founded with a fundamental contradiction at its heart. A nation dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal also permitted, protected, and profited from the enslavement of millions of people. The founders knew this was a problem, but they chose compromise over confrontation, hoping that future generations would find a solution. Future generations did not find a solution. Instead, they found cotton. The cotton boom of the early 19th century made slavery more profitable, more entrenched, and more central to the Southern economy and Southern identity than the founders could have imagined. As slavery grew, so did the political power of the slaveholding class. And as the North industrialized and developed along different lines, the two sections of the country grew further and further apart. Every attempt at compromise, the Missouri Compromise, the Compromise of 1850, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, was really just a way of postponing the inevitable reckoning. Each compromise papered over the underlying issue without resolving it, and each time the issue resurfaced, the passions were hotter, the stakes were higher, and the room for maneuver was smaller. By 1860, the political system had been destroyed by the very issue it was trying to manage. The Whig Party was dead. The Democratic Party was split. A new party had risen in the North dedicated to stopping the spread of slavery. When that party's candidate won the presidency without a single Southern electoral vote, the slaveholding states decided they would rather destroy the Union than accept the possibility that slavery might one day end. The Civil War was not inevitable in the sense that some specific sequence of events had to unfold in exactly the way it did. Different decisions at key moments might have delayed the crisis or changed its character. But the fundamental conflict between a society built on slavery and a society built on free labor was always going to reach a breaking point. The question was never whether the crisis would come, but when and in what form. Abraham Lincoln understood this better than anyone. In his second inaugural address, delivered in March of 1865, with the war almost over, Lincoln reflected on its causes with a clarity and honesty that still resonates. He noted that both sides had prayed to the same God, that both had invoked his aid against the other. But he also acknowledged the obvious. It may seem strange that any men should dare to ask a just God's assistance in wringing their bread from the sweat of other men's faces, and he offered his interpretation of the war's meaning. Fondly do we hope, fervently do we pray, that this mighty scourge of war may speedily pass away. Yet, if God wills that it continue until all the wealth piled by the bondsman's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, and until every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be paid by another drawn with the sword, as was said 3,000 years ago, so still it must be said, the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. The Civil War cost 750,000 lives. It freed 4 million people. It preserved the Union. It did not end racism or inequality or the struggle for justice, but it answered the question that the founders had refused to answer. The United States would be one nation, and that nation would no longer permit human beings to be owned as property. That is why the Civil War happened, and that is why it still matters.